Good morning. This webinar offers closed captioning. To enable closed captioning, click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred method. Welcome to the Chicago Department of Business Affairs Consumer Protection webinar. Please note any website or email that I mentioned will be posted in the chat. For those seeking business license assistance, you can visit the Small Business Center here at City Hall or call 312-74-GO-BIZ. Also, business license can be applied for or renewed online at chicagobusinessdirect.org. If you are a part of the BACP Entrepreneur Certificate Program, you can get credit for joining this webinar by sending an email to bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org. To learn more about this program, please visit chicago.gov/business education. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at youtube.com/Chicago BACP. We encourage all attendees to ask questions. Please use the chat to send your questions. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. Please note that the views, information, and opinions expressed during this webinar are solely those of the presenter and does not necessarily represent the official policy or position for the Department of Business Affairs, Consumer Protection, or the City of Chicago. At this time, I now turn the webinar over to Erica for us to begin.
Thank you so much. My name is Erica Spangler Raz, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Director of Pro Bono and for the transactional legal support for nonprofits and small businesses at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. We are a 50-plus-year-old civil rights organization, and we have a modern civil rights mission. So we work to secure racial equity and economic opportunity for all. We use all the legal tools to advance our mission, whether that's community and legal education, like this webinar, but also tools for policy advocacy, litigation, and impact litigation in areas of civil rights. For this webinar, we're going to talk about legal and practical considerations for starting a nonprofit. There's going to be several times where I'm going to be referring to our website. All the information on our website is free and accessible to the public. We have a library of resources. So if there's anything, and I think the city is going to put the website in the chat, it's clccrul.org. And we have additional workshops and other webinars that are also listed on our website for additional information. So I think the first thing that we want to do for covering the legal and practical considerations for starting a nonprofit is kind of go through our roadmap today. First, we're going to talk about the realities of starting a nonprofit. There's myths and just things that kind of go around, or you hear things from other people. So we really want to go through what some of those are and talk about those. What are the realities of starting a nonprofit, and what are the issues that need to be addressed by the founder. And then we'll go through the process of starting a nonprofit. There is a pre-planning process, and then there is the legal steps to start the nonprofit and get income tax exemption. Whenever we're starting and running a nonprofit, there are some maintenance things that need to be done to maintain the corporate status, to maintain the income tax exemption. And so we'll talk about some of those maintenance items. And then finally, we'll talk kind of like a summary and tips for success if you're a nonprofit founder, you have this idea for starting an organization. And as was mentioned earlier, we'll have a Q&A session, and hopefully you can come away with some answers to your questions. So let's dive in. The realities of starting a nonprofit. So when we're talking about a nonprofit, that term is really this overarching term that's used interchangeably with these other terms often. Sometimes it's not-for-profit, nonprofit, organization. And here, for purposes of this seminar, we're really talking about a 501c3, that's from the Internal Revenue Code, 501c3 public charity, so not a private foundation. So this is an organization that is expecting to be conducting charitable activities. So we're not talking about family foundations, private foundations, corporate foundations. We're really talking about the nonprofits that are kind of like in the community, on the ground, doing good work, and that serve what we call a charitable class or a charitable group. So let's just start with that piece. And then we want to kind of cover what are the reasons for starting a nonprofit? Why do people do this? First and foremost, it's going to be because There's some kind of mission. You as a, as a community person or founder of a nonprofit, or you have this idea, you want to see some kind of positive change in your community. And so the mission is of the utmost importance for why, or the purpose for creating the nonprofit. Another reason could be that, society needs really new ideas, innovative ideas, creative ideas to solve complex social problems. And a nonprofit structure can be one of the best ways to generate and kind of incubate some of these new ideas. In line with that, you can get access to resources beyond those that's in your own bank account or your own pocketbook. And so that's where you can access donations from family members, from friends, your network, corporations, foundations, even the government. There's grants available for what your organization is doing. So there is an expansion for the access of resources beyond you as an individual doing good work in your neighborhood. And then finally, it could be that you're looking for collaboration, right? So you want to work with family, friends, a board, staff, volunteers, community leaders, other nonprofits, other agencies to really solve the social issues. So those are really great, wonderful reasons to start a nonprofit. Now, the realities for starting a nonprofit is that, and again, we're talking about an organization, a public charity, a 501c3 public charity that has income tax exemption, is that with the benefit of this income tax exemption comes some limitations on the activities that the charity can conduct. Primarily, that's going to be, prohibitions on political campaign activity and limitations on lobbying activity for making some of the changes that you may want to take. There are other nonprofit exemptions that may be allowable to do certain types of activities, but not necessarily within a public charity that gets the tax deductible donation. The second thing that the real reality is that there's a lot of administrative reporting and a lot of administrative work and file keeping and things like that. And so there's going to be at least three, maybe more, but mostly three annual reporting requirements that are in the various government agencies. And I say that there may be more because it depends on what, licenses or other kinds of things that your organization may need to comply with. So that's part of that administrative burden of, like, just like it is with running a business, how if you own a business or run a business, you've got a separate bank account for that business, perhaps. If you're not a sole proprietor, if you created a separate entity, and all of those filings and taxes and things like that you have to keep separate for your business, same thing applies for nonprofit. The third bullet point on here is probably what I consider the most difficult. And I've been advising nonprofits for almost 20 years, and getting the money and getting that, even if there is a possibility for getting access to additional resources beyond your own self-funded or trying to do good, it is really difficult. And so there are some challenges in raising the funds. And with those challenges also come with, say that you are successful, you do have to track funder deliverables, you have to do perhaps funder reports, depending on the types of funding that you get. If it's a government grant, you may have to do tracking or vouchers to submit those. So it is, again, a lot of administrative work. And then finally, just because we have income tax exemption, I do want to address this kind of recurring myth that's out there, is that if you have income tax exemption, that means you just basically have income tax exemption for everything. And that's not necessarily the case. If you have income tax exemption to do a specific type of charitable work, there may be other taxes that are not income taxes that your organization has to pay. And we'll talk about that more towards the end of the session. But primarily that could be, sales tax that your organization still has to pay, property taxes that your organization has to pay. There may be times where your organization is going to have to pay income taxes. It may be doing some activities that are not income tax exempt and are more commercial in nature. and therefore it is not within the exempt activities that would be conducted by the organization. Some additional nonprofit realities that we do want to make sure that we're addressed is that just like a small business, the startup success is relatively low. When I'm working with organizations, I really want to ask them about what their plans are before they start, because the more planning that goes into this, the higher rate of success that the organization will be up and running in 3 years and 5 years, and that's what we want. So even if someone kind of trudges through all the legal work on their own, or hires an attorney or an accountant to get through all the forms to be filed, that doesn't mean that the organization is going to be successful at raising money. And that can be one of the main determining factors of whether or not the organization is, up and running, conducting activities 3 or 5 years out. So that is just something to always keep in mind. So if you're a founder and you're thinking about starting a nonprofit, we just want to, do this with your eyes open and know that, you have to do some planning and make sure that you can raise the funds to do or conduct the activities that you want to do, if those activities require access to resources that are not your own. If you're going to need, to purchase things or to provide services or pay wages or things like that. Kind of going along that line is that competition for funding is fierce. It's not like there's a number of wealthy donors that are just, sitting and waiting to give away lots and lots of money for new organizations that don't have a track record for doing this. So starting up a new nonprofit, it's very, very difficult. And oftentimes we want to show some early success and impact so that you can start getting the grants coming in there. Because one thing is that when donors and funders or private foundation funders see that there is success, or they see other people that are willing to invest in the mission of your organization, then it makes it more likely that you will get more funding. So funding attracts more funding, in short. The third bullet here is lack of control and ownership. And a lot of times I'm speaking with nonprofit founders, and so I always want to make sure that this point is clear. Just because this idea to start this nonprofit, this mission to start this nonprofit, that you are putting in all that kind of like sweat equity, you don't own anything. And that because there's no ownership in a nonprofit corporation, and we'll get to how that works a little bit later, it also means that one person does not control the decision making for what the nonprofit will do, its strategic plan, things like that. So as a nonprofit founder, it is possible that the board of directors, if they decide to oust you from the board, or if you have a board position, or if you are an executive director, may decide to terminate your employment as executive director. That is a reality. That is a legal reality. And so if there are any qualms or concerns about that, it's better to know that up front, rather than go in with the assumption that this is my idea. I'm doing this for the next 10 years, and I'm going to be putting all of my money into it, and that nobody else can get rid of me. I get to be director for life. So that is something that we want to just kind of address right away. This is the reality of working, within the structure of a nonprofit corporation with 501c3 public charity income tax exemption. The 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet is really due to the transparency laws. So because nonprofits get the benefit of income tax exemption, there's transparency that needs to be had with the nonprofit's financials. And so there can be scrutiny by the general public, and with funders about what are you using the money for. They're looking for reports, and your the reports that you file with the government agencies, for example, the Attorney General's Form 990 and the IRS Form 990, those are available for public inspection. And so you have to be aware of that. That is a reality of starting and running a nonprofit, is that there are these transparency laws. And then finally, there is this concept that comes up where there are difficulties with board of directors. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, that when we have a nonprofit founder and they are relinquishing control to a board of directors, it is possible that there will be disagreements among the board and including with the founder regarding the strategic direction of the organization. And so this, what we call board discord, either the board directors don't agree with each other, they don't agree with the founder. It just tends to happen. And so the more that everyone goes in with the thinking that everybody's on the same page regarding what the organization is going to do and everybody's mission aligned, with that, then the easier it will be. But it is kind of a reality of, working with boards of directors. Not that this doesn't happen in the for-profit world too. So this often happens in the nonprofit or in the for-profit sector as well. And if for some reason the organization that you want to start, if all those realities aren't something that that really are sitting well with you as a nonprofit founder, saying, I am not willing to give up control. And I don't want other people telling me what to do. If you are a founder that's like, this is hard to sit with, there are some other options, right? And so we want to just put those out there. One of the things that you can do, and is a common one, is if the innovative idea is something that includes some kind of commercial activity, selling a product or a service at some kind of fair market rate, or fair market value, such that it's not discounted because the people who your target market is not, or is in fact somebody that can afford what is a market rate for that product or service. It may be an option to create a purposeful for-profit, or sometimes called a for-profit social enterprise. A social enterprise is a business term. It's a business construct. So there can be social enterprises that are nonprofits, social enterprises that are for-profits, and there are specific legal structures that really kind of serve the social enterprise business model. I'll get to those in a minute, but I just want to mention that, if commercial activity, business type activity is something that, is one of your, innovative ideas, or a piece of your innovative ideas, that may be an option. Another one is to just create an informal group, a group of people doing good together. Even if it's like a mutual aid organization, doesn't necessarily need to take advantage of this formal nonprofit structure. If there's, and particularly this works well when there's no funding and very little risk, very little individual risk to what the activities that are being done. And then really nobody's trying to gather or solicit funds that are meaning to be tax deductible to the donor, are from a private foundation. Nobody needs that income tax exemption. So like loose groups, sometimes even coalitions of groups or grassroots groups that are just, they're not really intending to raise money. Maybe an informal group of individuals or residents or neighborhoods that, want to do like a mutual aid or a food drive and partner with another organization, which is the third one. That can be another option where we don't have to deal with all this administrative burden, all the form filings and starting up. We can just partner with an existing organization if we're not going to be doing it on our own. That way we get the benefit of, that other organization taking, all of the burden, the administrative burden, and soliciting the funds if that's necessary. And maybe you get paid as an independent contractor, or you get paid as an employee if you're bold enough to propose that situation and to raise the funds to do that, or maybe you're just doing it as a volunteer. That's okay too. And then finally is a fiscal sponsorship type arrangement. Fiscal sponsorship it works a little bit like an incubator for a nonprofit idea. So if you are a founder that has identified another organization that has a similar mission, that already has 501c3 status, has a pretty good reputation in the community, in the foundation community, and in donor philanthropic community, then it might be something to partner with that organization and basically create a project within that other organization. There is a number of materials that we have on our website that kind of talk through fiscal sponsorships. We also have additional free webinars in our nonprofit resources section that will talk more thoroughly about fiscal sponsorship. Fiscal sponsorship is one of the ways where it can really help a founder before they have everything together, of, making sure that they know that their idea is going to be viable, that they're going to be able to raise the funds to make it successful. Fiscal sponsorship is a really great option. So I always want to mention that you can wait till you get, 2 years out in a fiscal sponsorship to be like, oh yeah, this is something that we actually do want to go and get income tax exemption, and we will spend the funds to pay the filing fees and to go through the process and the weight of the work and the mental load for doing all of those forms. The other thing about a fiscal sponsor that I just want to mention before I go on to the next section is that they often will charge an administrative fee, and that can be between 5 and 50% just off the top of everything that comes in. So partnering with a fiscal sponsor, it's not like it doesn't have its burden or costs associated with it. Some fiscal sponsors are willing to provide some like technical assistance. They can help you write grants. They can provide insurance for some of the activities that you're doing. So I did want to mention that there are some additional things with a fiscal sponsorship. Okay, so a purposeful for-profit. This is like that social enterprise business idea that you have. Now, form follows function in all of these. So what we really want you to do is kind of go through your planning process, see what activities that you're going to do, what's your target market, all the same things that you would do for business planning if you were going to start a business, do the same thing for your nonprofit. And then kind of think about maybe a purposeful for-profit or an L3C or a benefit corporation might be a legal structure that is an option. Those two are the most common. Now, an L3C is a low profit limited liability company, so it is still an LLC. A benefit corporation is still a corporation. It has shareholders. It does have a benefit officer, so to have some kind of measurement of what the mission or social purpose and how that is being accomplished is within the benefit corporation structure. Now, one of the main things and the benefits of having one of these purposeful for-profit structures is that it allows the pursuit of this charitable purpose, of this mission, this social purpose, while it's conducting commercial activities. It's really the only way that it's going to happen is if there's going to be a product or a service that's commercial activity that's going to be viable, because the founder is, again, retaining the ownership and control, which means that it is not eligible for income tax exemption. So if it's not eligible for income tax exemption, then the business model cannot rely on philanthropic revenue. It does not receive tax deductible donations. It does not receive private foundation grants. Typically, there are some situations where it can receive certain types of grants that would be eligible for other for-profit businesses, but it's not typically one that the business model is reliant on that type of revenue. So if it's a for-profit, it's eventually going to need to be able to generate revenue, at least to come even, at least to break even, which hopefully is more than breaking even, so that it can dedicate perhaps more funds to its social purpose. All right, so let's talk about the nonprofit legal structure. So this is kind of the process and kind of like what is I'm sorry, not the process, but this is the structure that is most common for 501c3 public charities. Now, there's basically 3 important things to keep in mind for a nonprofit structure that is kind of a little bit different from a for-profit or purposeful for-profit structure. One is that is this, again, a corporation structure. So it is formed under the Illinois Not-for-Profit Corporation Act. Even though it is a corporation, it has no shareholders. So that's where that no ownership comes in. It is governed by, well, it can have membership governance or non-member governance. It's governed by its board of directors that makes decisions according to the bylaws. And there's additional FAQs about how bylaws get drafted and what decisions get made in the bylaws. So it's a little bit, there's more information on our website than we have time to go through here, but it's really important to understand that this is a corporation. It has the benefit of limited liability, just like any other corporation has, but there's no owners. So there's no shareholders. There's no one person that gets this. You have to have at least 3 people on the board. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that when we get to the process. The federal income tax exemption. So this corporation applies for federal income tax exemption. That's that 501c3 status. The benefit of 501c3 status, even though there's like 30 some different types, is that it is able to get tax deductible donations. So donors that make charitable contributions to the nonprofit are able to deduct those donations on their individual tax returns, assuming that they itemize their deduction. Don't worry so much about that. Donors make their own tax decisions with their own tax advisors. In addition, with this nonprofit legal structure, as I mentioned earlier, the corporation with income tax exemption is also going to be subject to other compliance regulations. So in order to solicit or ask for grants or donations, donations from the public or grants from private foundations, it's going to need to register as a charitable organization with the Charitable Trust Bureau of the Illinois Attorney General's Office. That's just one layer, but there could be other layers depending on what the nonprofit's operations are. So there's other compliance regulations related to that. When we get to this question of, because we're talking about form follows function, we often want nonprofit founders and the people who are getting together to start the nonprofit to really do some planning. There are some questions that we ask as advisors that will help us determine which is the better structure. Are we going to go and explore that nonprofit structure with 501c3 status, maybe another different tax exempt status? Or are we going to talk about a for-profit structure, whether that's an LLC, an L3C, or some of those other types of structures, an S corporation, C corporation, benefit corporation? So there's all different structures, but they're mainly fall into 2 different groups. Is it a nonprofit structure with what type of income tax exemption? Right, today we're talking about 501c3, or is it a for-profit structure that, you know, we want to talk about, we want to look into what are the different for-profit structures that make sense for the type of business. When we're doing this, there are certain things to keep in mind. There are a lot of similarities, and I've kind of alluded to them as I've been talking about running a for-profit business or a nonprofit business. And I say the nonprofit business is in like, it still needs to, you know, at the end of the day, make sure that it can pay its employees just like a for-profit business are. So there are a lot of similarities, and the planning process can be very similar. They both serve a specific target market or a target community. They have a management structure. They need to be strategic in how they are making decisions. It is a competitive environment, a difficult environment for both small businesses, especially in our somewhat post-COVID world, but also in the nonprofit sector as well, because I had mentioned that funding is very fierce. And in addition to that kind of strategic thinking here is that if it's a for-profit business, there is this competitive environment, and even businesses will need to evaluate, you know, their products and services with the competitive environment in mind. At the same time, nonprofits need to evaluate their program's effectiveness. So that kind of strategic planning and evaluation is part of the process of business planning, of making sure that you know that you're going to be able to respond to the needs of your target market or your target community or target clients. And then I think finally the most important is that the financials are vital. So, nonprofits don't get off the ground if they're unable to, get the funds to do the work that they need to do. Nonprofit budgets are a little bit more complex than, starting up a for-profit business. But both of them really rely on whether they can have the funds to be, number one, raise enough money to be sustainable, generate a profit. And nonprofits do need to have a profit. It's just that the profits don't go to be distributed to the owners. The profit goes back and gets invested into the mission by serving additional clients, expanding programs and things like that. So nonprofits do actually make a profit. So when we go through all this business planning process, and I have another slide that kind of talks a little bit more about that. There's four main things that we, as advisors to nonprofits, will be looking for as to whether the activities, the idea, the business should go into a for-profit structure or a nonprofit structure. One thing that we're going to be looking for is like, where do profits go? And I had mentioned that nonprofits need to make a profit. They need to be able to have money at the end of the day. We don't want them to go into debt. Sure, they can borrow a line of credit when they have more, operations. They need to have cash reserves and things like that. But at the end of the day, after everything is paid for, where do the profits go? In a nonprofit, it goes back into the mission. In a for-profit, the business owners get the profit, right? The owners get the profit. And so if the founder, or the person with the idea for starting this, wants to make money, and wants to, get the proceeds, and I'm not talking about employment, but the proceeds of the profit that the money is being raised for, that is kind of looking at more of a for-profit structure. And the control, the other one that I mentioned, when a founder wants to make all the decisions, or the decisions will be made by the founder and, perhaps her husband or her wife or, whatever, a family member, or the control is within a small group of people, we're probably talking about somebody who's going to be in a for-profit model. Because in a nonprofit, the decision making is in that board of directors. And that is like, there's no owners, and the control for the decision making is in this board of directors. The primary purpose or the mission, sometimes we'll see that there is a primary purpose that is a social purpose, and that's that mission. When we're dealing with purposeful for-profits, they also have a social mission, but the primary purpose or the primary ultimate thing to be done is really to make the money, right? And so if the social mission and all the activities are going to be measured by the mission, then we're probably looking at a nonprofit structure. And then finally, the activities. There are certain activities that are considered exempt activities. And so when we have what the activities are, what are you actually doing? That's where we want to look for your business plan to say, what are these specific activities that are being conducted and who is benefiting from those activities? All right, so now let's go to the process of starting a nonprofit. In the couple slides before, I had said that before we do any kind of legal steps, we're going to be doing a business plan. And I kind of pre-spoke here because there's 3 B's, what we call. Before the legal steps, we've got the board of directors, the business plan, or the budget, and the budget. Those 3 are and. And so for the nonprofit corporation that we're going to be forming, the board of directors must be, at least in Illinois, it has to be at least 3 people. You want those 3 people to have independent judgment. So they're not here to serve you as a founder, but they're here to serve, or you're being recruited because they're helping the organization get started, but they're not going to do everything that you say as a founder that they should do. So that's something, and hopefully that they are helpful to you. But the fact that they are independent is very important. Each director, the other thing is that the directors, hopefully you're recruiting directors that expect to be volunteers. They are not expected to be hired as employees. You can have some, you can have 1, maybe 2 people that expect to eventually be hired as employees and be compensated through wages. But for the wearing the hat of a board, as a director on the board of directors, that is a volunteer position. Now, each director gets one vote, and so not everybody is going to agree. It could be, 2-1. Hopefully, you have more than 3 directors. So hopefully, you have 5 to 7 for a new startup of these independent volunteer directors who are not family members and also not hoping to be staff. So that's the board of directors that you need to recruit. Now you have the next B, which is the business plan. I should mention that for the board of directors, typically the officers are elected from the board. On all the officers' duties are described in the bylaws. We have additional materials on our website that kind of go through what's president, treasurer, secretary, and what those officer positions. What's the board role versus the executive director's role. What are the fiduciary duties? All that information is on our website. So I encourage you to go look at that. And there's all these little mini videos. They're like 5 minutes long that kind of explain all the different roles. So I encourage you to go do that. Okay, so now the second piece, which is the business plan, and I kind of talked about what you need to put in your business plan. What are the activities that you're doing? Who are you serving? This for a nonprofit, we're looking for what's your case statement. Why are you starting this organization? What's your theory of change? Why do you think that the activities that you're going to be conducting are going to make some kind of impact? And so it should explain some of those. Now you can probably use some kind of internet search and get lots and lots of samples for nonprofit business plans that show theories of change and case statements and things like that. A really important component of a business plan is going to be your fundraising plan. Now, this could be part of your financial plan that is in the third B below, which is the budget. But either way, whether it's a revenue generation that's part of the budget, or if it's a fundraising plan as part of the business plan, either way, it is a component that does need to be put together, but as you're pre-planning before you start the process of starting the corporation. So for a budget or a financial plan, you want to at least, this is a little bit harder to describe, but basically you want to at least have a projected budget. You may not know what's coming in because you haven't started yet, and that is okay. But to be able to do the business planning to see, I think we're going to be able to get private foundations. Who are the private foundations that are funding in our issue area? How much are these grants that this foundation is giving out? All of those types of things you want to kind of look for. That can help you put together at least some ideas and some planning around projected financials. So always just keep that in mind. You can also try to look at some of the samples. We've got a sample budget template that's on our website as part of our application. So there are additional materials out there to help you put some of these materials together. And I will say this whole piece before the legal step, it's really important that we don't just go and Google and say, how do I start a nonprofit? And then go file articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. It's really important that you go through this process. Sometimes, and this is kind of what happens, is that sometimes you'll recruit your board of directors and you've got 3 people, and then the 3 of you start business planning. And then you think, oh my gosh, there's a gap in what we have on our board of directors. So you go back and find more people. They're going to help you. Now you've got 5 people, and then you do your business planning, and then you do your budget. And then your budget doesn't make sense because you're spending more money than you're bringing in. So then you go back to your business plan, and then you put down like you're going to do some things in year 1, and some things are going to just have to be pushed to year 2. And this is kind of this iterative process that happens that sometimes takes 2 months. And sometimes it takes 2 years. And that's where I see a lot of benefit in doing something like a fiscal sponsorship, because it allows you to keep going and kind of test the waters, where you may not have everything fully flushed out in your case statement or your theory of change, but you've got a really good idea, you got a really good start. And all of that pre-planning also helps show a fiscal sponsor about the thoughtfulness and the intention in putting this together. Okay, so now we're into starting the legal step. And we're going to assume at this point that all that business planning and recruiting an independent board of directors, all that budgeting, that has all been done. So now we're going to actually start the formation. Okay, so there's several steps for nonprofit formation, and basically they fall into these 3 stages, and that's based on the government filings that are needed. One I mentioned, we got that Illinois not-for-profit corporation. The second one is obtaining income tax exemption, and then the third one is registering as a charitable organization so that you can solicit funds. And again, there may be more. This is the initial formation step. This is not everything that the organization is going to have to comply with, but this is the typical formation process. All right, so for phase 1, we're going to create an Illinois not-for-profit corporation. So for this first phase, to create this corporation, we need to file articles of incorporation with the Illinois Secretary of State. CyberGuardIllinois.com is the website for the Secretary of State. The form that you need is called NFP 10210. NFP stands for not for profit. And so you can go into the publication section of that website on the Secretary of State, and then you will need to include the specific Internal Revenue Code language that states that it will have a charitable purpose under 501c3, and it will include the limitations language that is needed to say that this corporation is only going to do insubstantial lobbying. It's not going to do any political campaign activity. All those things need to be incorporated into this formation document, your organizing document, your articles of incorporation. Those words all mean the same thing. The second thing that you're going to do is obtain an EIN from the IRS. An EIN is like a social security number for this new entity that you just created. This articles of incorporation that you filed now creates an entity, and this entity, this little baby of yours, needs a social security number. This is free from the IRS. You can go to the IRS website, you can click a button, say get an EIN, and you can submit the form, and you can get it for free. Please do not pay for someone else to get you an EIN. It is very simple. You can get it on your own. I'm always surprised to see that there are other people who have spent hundreds of dollars for something that our government is giving away for free. And it's easy and it's online. So please just do that process. And then the third thing, again, this is our corporate formation, is that we've got to adopt some bylaws and a conflict of interest policy. So bylaws I had referenced earlier, this is your governing document that tells the board how it's going to make decisions. We can have a governance structure that has a membership governance, or we can have non-member governance, which primarily is and both of them have the board of directors as the governing body. So the directors, the members, directors, and officers, their roles are outlined in those bylaws. Bylaws also address meetings. So in Illinois, we have to have at least an annual meeting, but hopefully your board is meeting more often than just once a year. Many nonprofit startups are meeting every month. That is probably best, especially as you're going through your planning process. It's really good to get in the habit of meeting of the board to meet. Another important thing to note is quorum. So quorum is it defines the number of directors that are present at a meeting of the directors for a corporation to act, basically to be the official act of the corporation. So if you have 5 people on your board, your quorum might be 51%. And that means that in order for your board to make an action at a meeting, there has to be at least 3 people present at that meeting with the majority passing for that to be the official act of the corporation. There's so much information on our website about bylaws and all these roles that I mentioned earlier. So again, I encourage you to go there and check them out. All right, so that was phase 1, and that's creation of the entity. Phase 2 is obtaining income tax exemption. So this is the IRS form. And there's actually 2 different forms, but we'll get to that probably in the next slide. But you basically apply for income tax. You take your corporation, you go to the federal government, and you apply for income tax exemption. There's a lot of information on the IRS website. That's that link there. This information is really easy to understand. So it's not a whole bunch of Internal Revenue Code. The IRS does have a number of publications and articles that are really meant for regular people that just serve on nonprofit boards so that they can really understand the filings and their responsibilities. So please do check out the irs.gov website and look at the charities and nonprofits division. There's also another one that I recommend, which is called stayexempt.org. That's another good one from the IRS as well. So the first thing is you apply for income tax exemption with the IRS. In this application stage, when you file this form 1023, which I'll show on the next page, you have to show that the corporation is organized and operated for a charitable purpose. So this is where you're going to say that you've got no benefit for private interest, okay? No substantial lobbying, no political activities, and then all assets are dedicated to the charitable purpose in perpetuity. So I'm going to go through each of these, at least two of these that I haven't discussed earlier, because I think I've driven it home about the lobbying and political activity. But the first one is that we're organized and operated for a charitable purpose, not for the benefit of private interest. So here, let me explain this in an example. So if we have, say for example, you've got a for-profit tutoring service. I'm just going to use this as throwing this out there. You've got a for-profit business and it's a tutoring service, and you're having trouble running the tutoring service as a business because the families that you are serving cannot afford the market rate for which you charge. You've searched around, this is what tutoring services cost. Your charge, your fees are in line with the market, but the families that you serve are unable to afford that. Now, you may think, well, if they can't afford it, but there's all these other nonprofits and donors, or private foundations and donors that are willing to give money for these services, why can't I access them? Because I'm a for-profit business. I'm going to start a nonprofit that will seek grants to get money to pay my for-profit business so that I can give, so it can subsidize the cost of the families that receive tutoring. So this is where you're basically starting a shell nonprofit to benefit your for-profit business. That is not allowable. So there'll be some language that says no private inurement. That's what we're talking about. We cannot create a nonprofit whose ultimately real purpose is to benefit a for-profit business or to benefit an individual, like a single individual, as opposed to a large charitable class of people or a community. And then the final bullet that I had mentioned, I think I've kind of driven the other two home, is that all assets are dedicated to a charitable purpose in perpetuity. So if you start this nonprofit and ultimately it can't get off the ground, it's got some money, but the board of directors has decided it's going to close. You've got a few $100s after paying all the creditors, you sold all the assets, you sold the building, you sold the trucks that were, taking everybody to their after school programs or whatever, and you've got some money left. At the end of the day, you got to distribute those assets to another 501c3 charity, public charity, with a similar mission as this organization. It cannot, and that would be what the final distribution will be. That's all the assets are dedicated to charitable purpose, and then that forever. So then when that organization closes, it has to make sure that its assets go to another 501c3 as well. What this does not mean, or what this means, is that if the organization is unable to start up and you as a founder have put in all this money of your own pocket into this organization and it didn't come down, and upon dissolution, you don't get your money back. That money has to go to another 501c3 organization. So if it doesn't get off the ground, if you get off the ground, but then you have to close, no founders get that money back. So it can't be distributed to individuals. It has to go to another 501c3 with a similar mission. It's one of those, things that of the nonprofit realities. I probably should add it to that slide as well. Okay, So we're still at this phase 2, and we're just continuing on, and we're saying we know that we have to file this IRS form 1023 to get the income tax exemption. The form 1023 is the one that seeks 501c3 status. There's different forms. There's other forms if you wanted to seek a different tax exempt status, but primarily we're talking about public charities. So we're talking about 501c3, and so we use form 1023 to file. There's 2 forms. There's the 1023 EZ, and then there's the standard 1023. The 1023 EZ is for organizations that have projected or have less than $50,000 in gross receipts for each of the first 3 years and less than $250,000 in assets. So that is it's basically a 3-page form. You can file this online. It's $250. Here's the kicker though. In order to file this form, you have to be able to use this eligibility worksheet, which is, again, go to irs.gov, put in 1023 EZ, and it'll pop up. You can look at the eligibility worksheet. If you do not understand the eligibility worksheet, which is about 8 pages, now remember, the form is 3 pages, so the eligibility worksheet is 8 pages, and if there's references to the code, to the Internal Revenue Code, that may not be understandable if you are not an accountant or a lawyer. And if you don't understand them, I would strongly encourage you to seek professional guidance from an accountant or a lawyer to make sure that you are, number one, eligible, that your organizational documents have the required language, because it's really been, I've seen this on the back end of it where organizations didn't know that they checked the wrong box. And it's kind of more of a headache and more of a mental energy for the organization's, budding, founders who really want to focus on doing the mission activities, but now have this headache in trying to figure out their forms and their status with the IRS. So that is my one recommendation. And that it's meant to be easy, but actually when you look at this stuff, if you don't know what it means and you don't have help, probably don't file it until you're able to get the help so that we don't check the wrong box. The processing for that is actually pretty quick though. In step 4, I have the link that shows you where you can find out your application is in the processing. But it's pretty fast for this 1023 easy. Now, the standard 1023 tends to be filed when an organization is planning to hire staff, because usually that means that there's going to be more than $50,000 in gross receipts, because you would have more than $50,000 in expenses in your operating budget. So the standard 1023 is like about 12 pages, sometimes 13 pages. And then there's additional schedules that may need to be filed in addition or as part of the form in addition, like if you have scholarship, or if you're filing more than 27 months from the date of incorporation. So there's additional forms to be filled out. It's important to do this, it's important to know that with this longer form, you also have to submit copies of your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your conflicts of interest policy, and the IRS agent will look at those. You have to describe your activities. There's a lot of questions about directors and compensation and your projections. You may have to put together a 3-year projected budget. And then all of these different things put together, it can be a little bit more cumbersome, not a little bit. It is more cumbersome. It is much more cumbersome to do the standard 1023. It has a longer processing and has a higher filing fee. So it's $600 to do the standard 1023. One thing I will say is that the 1023 is also able to be filed online. And it does have that longer processing fee. So you can always look at that, or you can even Google this. Where's my application for tax exempt status? And it will show up and show you how long the processing is. The 1023 is typically turned around very quickly. I think I've seen it as fast as a month. And then the standard 1023 is typically in the 4 to 6 month range, but there were times where it was, and again, this is like pandemic times where it was over a year, where, everybody was trying to figure out, the remote processing and remote work and things like that. And that's not untrue for our government agencies. Okay. So I think that is phase 2 for obtaining income tax exemption. we are going to go to phase 3, which is registering as a charitable organization. And so this is the one that you have to file in order to solicit or hold charitable funds. There is a fine. There's a penalty fine for soliciting charitable contributions. So if you ask for donations before you register as a charitable organization, then you will be subject to a fine, and it's $200, which, you know, may not seem like a lot, but that's $200 that you cannot then spend on your first, art painting for kids event, if that's what you're going to be doing. So in order to register with the Illinois Attorney General's Office, the Charitable Trust Bureau, you can go to the website and download the forms. There's 2 different types of forms. One is called the CO1, charitable organization is CO. That is your registration form. And then you have to file a financial form. And if your organization has been in existence for less than 12 months, then you file the CO2. And then if your organization has been in existence for more than 12 months, you've been in existence for a year, then you file the AG 990IL. And so one of the annual reporting requirements is this AG 990IL, so you will see that come up again. But those are the 2 forms that you would have to file. There are additional documentation that you have to file with this CO1. So there's going to need to be a list of your board of directors. You're going to need to submit your articles, your bylaws. The Attorney General's Office wants to know what the status, the tax exempt status is, whether you filed something with the IRS, or whether your application is pending, or whether you're in a fiscal sponsorship. So there's additional information that are there's questions on those forms to be able to ask the status of your organization and kind of like, have you solicited funds yet? The other thing to keep in mind is that we have this as solicitation in Illinois. So there's 2 acts, actually. There's the Charitable Trust Act, and then there's the Solicitation for Charity Act. Those 2 acts together, you select them both, and that will cover Illinois and here. But if your organization or your board members is going to be soliciting funds nationwide, or in Wisconsin, you need to check whether or not that other state requires registration as a charitable organization. It should usually be in the Attorney General's Office. There may be, if you don't know, I would suggest finding out. Either you can look, or you can, honestly, you can just submit an inquiry form on our website. But there's additional information that you need to find out to make sure that you're in compliance with the activities that you're conducting in that other state. And then there are these other issues. So those are the 3 phases for the formation work. It's creating the corporation, obtaining income tax exemption, creating the corporation at state level, income tax exemption at the federal level, and then registering as a charitable organization, again, back to the state level, but a different office, the AG. We have a bunch of other issues that they commonly come up as founders are starting their organization. And so here's a list here, and I'll kind of talk with through these very briefly. The first one is that unrelated income is taxable. So I alluded to this earlier, that only income to the nonprofit for its charitable activities, for its exempt activities, is tax exempt. So if the nonprofit, say you've gone through the process and you've determined, I'm not going to be a for-profit, I'm going to be a nonprofit. If the nonprofit carries out commercial activities, it's selling a product or a service at market rates, and it's on ongoing basis or a regular basis, and its only purpose is to raise money for the nonprofit, so that activity is not related to the nonprofit's mission. If you've got commercial activity and it's not related to the nonprofit's mission, then the nonprofit may have to pay taxes on that income to the IRS or the Illinois Department of Revenue, or IDOR. So that is something that unrelated income is taxable to the nonprofit. The second thing is state income tax exemption. Now, in Illinois, if you have federal income tax exempt status for your nonprofit, then you automatically get state income tax. So that's an easy one, unfortunately. Not true in other states like California or some of the other states. But for here, income tax exemption at the state level is is automatic if the organization receives federal income tax exemption. The third one is state sales tax exemption. So state sales tax exemption is not automatic. That's for when your nonprofit has like an arts program for kids and an after school program, and it needs to go buy paintbrushes and paint and smocks and all those types of things. And you go to the art store and you pay for those supplies, and your nonprofit also has to pay sales tax. So there is a process to apply for sales tax exemption. It's called an E number. That's what you want. It is not automatic. There is I'll just say there's more information on our website about sales tax exemption. It can be a little bit tricky to get. You go to cltcrul.org and it's under nonprofit resources, and it may be under archived resources. All right, so number 4 is the City of Chicago business license. So if you are basically operating within the city limits, then you may have to get a business license. Some of the common ones in the nonprofit sector are if your organization is running daycare type services, whether that's adult daycare or whether that's child daycare, there are licenses for that. There are for pet rescue and humane society type organizations, there are licenses for that. And I say this because even if your organization gets its business license, there may be additional licenses that the nonprofit may need to get as well. So when I work with cultural organizations or even like performing arts or arts organizations, they may need to get a public place of amusement license, a PPA license. So like dance troops or, mostly like cultural centers or things like that, there may be some requirements to get that. Now, the thing here is that the City of Chicago has a lot of information on their website for getting business licenses and the other licenses. You can go to that website, chicago.gov/BACP. There's a button that says licensing. So click that button. You can apply online and you can call them and ask a lot of questions. So it can be really, really helpful. And you don't need a lawyer to do it either. So that's something that can be really helpful as well. And then finally, county property tax exemption. So this is, again, kind of like sales tax exemption, it's state and local tax. So even if you own a building and you have federal income tax exemption, your building may not be property tax exempt. You may have to just assume in your budget and account for in your budget that you're going to be paying property taxes for that building. All right. So now we're going to, we're assuming we've formed our nonprofit, and we have to do the administrative reporting requirements and the maintenance of the nonprofit. Now, I always include some of the highlights or important points of maintaining the nonprofit status in any of these formation sessions that we do. And the reason is because I really want to address those nonprofit realities of there are these administrative burdens to be able to maintain the status that give you the benefit of access to those additional philanthropic resources to do this good work and run these innovative organizations. So to maintain the nonprofit, there's going to be at least three, maybe more, but at least 3 annual reports that need to be filed. If you have employees, there's more than that. You may have to have quarterly employment reports that you need to be filed with the Illinois Department of Revenue and the IRS. But let's just start. We've got just the corporate structure. We went to 3 different agencies to form it. We've got to go to those same 3 agencies and file annual reports for them. There's a publication on our website that gives you additional information, and it's called our annual reporting requirements. It's under our nonprofit resources section that gives you the form names. I believe it has links to the forms, and it also gives you the deadline. So the Secretary of State form is due before the first day of the month of incorporation. The Attorney General's form is due within 6 months after the end of the fiscal year, and the IRS form is due. It's called the Illinois Attorney General form is called the 990 AG 990 IL. And the IRS form is called the IRS 990. And there's different flavors for the IRS. It could be 990N, which is organizations less than $50,000. But again, all those different things are going to be on our website as well. The IRS form is filed with 5 months and 15 days after the end of the fiscal year. So all that stuff is on our annual reporting requirements FAQ. In addition to that, there may be other, requirements that, from the federal government, from the state, from the county, from the city. There are requirements and compliance requirements that come with any kind of licenses that depend on the activities that your nonprofit is conducting. So as I mentioned, with employment, there's going to be quarterly employment filings that need to be done, taxes that need to be paid, payroll taxes, for example, business licenses that need to be kept up, any kind of real estate taxes that need to be paid. And then, of course, there's certain regulated industries in the nonprofit sector where there's going to be additional filings. So like if you have shelters like domestic violence shelters, transitional shelters, things like that, there may be additional permits that you would need to get from local government to be able to run those things and zoning and things like that. So you'd have to get all those things squared away, and also maintain anything that that needs to be done. Okay, the additional things for maintaining a nonprofit is that you have to comply, and this is kind of more where your money's coming from, comply with the funder and donor requirements. So if you've got government contracts and you've got vouchers, you got to be able to track your deliverables, make sure that you're vouchering before the deadline for that voucher. So that comes with a lot of administrative requirements and administrative burden. There's private foundations that may want an interim report for what you're doing with the money. Board of directors issues. One of the things that I always want to mention is for maintaining the nonprofit is that you really need to continually recruit new board members. It is healthy to have board members roll off the board and for new ideas to come on. And so maintaining the nonprofit includes continually recruiting, people that will serve on committees that hopefully that you can orient and maybe recruit for board service, and then they will serve maybe, a term or two, and then they will recruit additional people that can serve as well through their own network. It's just really healthy to have these new ideas. There can be challenges when boards have people who have been serving on the board for 10 or 20 or 30 years. We really want to maintain the new ideas that come in. That is a healthy sign for a nonprofit. And then I kind of mentioned this before, the limitations and compliance activities for lobbying. If your organization is going to have lobbying activities, and again, there's only insubstantial lobbying, there's some tests that can be done. There's a form to file with the IRS if you want to elect one of the tests for measuring the lobbying activities. All of this is on our website, and there's additional requirements. If there's going to be lobbying, we have to make sure that if you have to figure out whether you need to register as a lobbyist at the city or state or federal level, and then there's compliance and reporting requirements for lobbying registration. So this is a whole bucket of activities that may require additional reporting requirements to again maintain the nonprofit status, or the nonprofit incurs fees and penalties, which then affect the nonprofit's ability to sustain itself. And then finally, this is do not conduct political activity, political campaign activity, like none, zero, zilch. The risk for doing this is revocation of the 501c3 status. So it is really, really important that what that this is not being conducted by anyone who says that they're part of your organization. Okay, so finally, as I mentioned, there's going to be some things where you're going to say, I have this idea, but I don't know if I'm ready, right? So some tips for success for where I've seen success in my almost 20 years of advising nonprofits. is that founders that surround themselves with people who have gone through this before and ask a lot of questions. Perhaps you know somebody else who's founded a nonprofit, or you have a friend of a friend. Please talk with them. Surround yourself with really smart and experienced people. Ask a lot of questions before doing anything. Ask them what they wish they would have known. This can be really, really helpful. Also, you need to ask questions of yourself, right? Am I willing to relinquish control to a board of directors? Really kind of plan thoroughly, explore those options. Can this activity be done within a purposeful for-profit? Will it be sustainable and generate the revenue needed, based on a certain price point for the commercial activities? It's really, really important that before doing any of the legal work, you do a lot of planning and you explore your options. Fortunately, there's additional things that you can do to get resources or information if that's what you're looking for. I keep mentioning our website because it has a lot of information. We do have a boot camp program. It's our emerging nonprofit training program. It takes founders through running or formation and starting a nonprofit. The next one is coming up is March 20th through 22nd. And there's information on that thing, and you can sign up to receive the registration link. And also, our organization, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, does provide pro bono legal assistance for new nonprofits for forming. So we do require you to have, your business plan, your board of directors, and your projected budget put together, or you have a fiscal sponsorship agreement, and kind of, what you've done within that fiscal sponsorship. We will recruit a volunteer attorney to do the legal work. So the articles, the bylaws, and everything that we talked about, conflict of interest policy, the IRS form, the CO1, the CO2, all of those different things. If that sounds like a lot, which it is, and you would rather focus on the mission, then please see if you can get some pro bono assistance in doing that formation work. So I think that unfortunately I wasn't able to kind of really manage the chat box or the questions. So I'm going to look to the city if there are questions that I should see. Oh wait, maybe I can look at the questions here. So somebody did ask questions that it looks like I probably would prefer not to answer specific questions about legal situations, and would rather have a confidential conversation. So I'm just gonna skip some of those that are there. Some questions about copies of the slides. Yes, we've sent those to the city and they're in the PDF, and they can be distributed. I'm gonna refer to the city on how they're gonna do that. So there's a question that says, when you are doing community programs or mentoring, would a nonprofit be better because you will need to fundraise and get grants and sponsorships for that? It's a common question, right? So if you're doing community programs and you need the resources and you think the resources that are going to pay for those programs are going to be from donations or from fundraisers that you do, then that may be something that makes sense, the nonprofit structure versus the for-profit structure. I'm going to guess that based on the time that the question was submitted, that it was whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit. There's a good question. How do we find a fiscal sponsor? So a lot of times this can be through relationships. So as you are planning and talking with other people who are doing the same thing, or Google and you find other organizations that are doing something similar but not quite, introduce yourself. Fiscal sponsorship can certainly be part of that conversation. The other thing that you can do is there can be dedicated fiscal sponsors. We have an FAQ on our website that talks about how you can go about perhaps finding a fiscal sponsor whose charitable purpose is to incubate other nonprofits in a particular area, like arts organizations or things like that, social justice organizations, racial justice organizations. There may be fiscal sponsors that are based in another state, and you can still take advantage of fiscal sponsorship if your organization is based in Chicago. Your fiscal sponsor doesn't necessarily have to be in your state. So that's something to think about. Okay. Does a nonprofit have to be a certain size? It does not. Most nonprofits start out small. I'm assuming that this has to do with revenue. And the primary thing for an organization to maintain its nonprofit status is that continuing to do charitable activities or exempt activities based on what its purpose is. But there's no gross receipt cap on a nonprofit. I'm not sure if the question is referring to board size. And that's really more of a practical one. So the Not-for-Profit Act doesn't address cap for number of board of directors, and there are some organizations that institutional size organizations, frankly, that have very, very large boards with like 30 people on them. And usually that has a really formal governance structure with committees and standing committees and things like that. In addition, those boards are maybe that size because of the size of the organization, the revenue, and the connections in the business sense for fundraising and using their network. I think that for small organizations that are starting out, you probably want to start out with like 5 to 7 board members. Once you get over the 20 size, a board of maybe 20, it is hard to get people together. And you really need people to get together to come and discuss the activities of the organization to make sure those directors are fulfilling their fiduciary duties. So really good question. I wasn't sure which way that was going, but I hope that I answered both of them. All right, I'm going to ask Stella, were there any that I missed? I went through the question and answer and the chat.
It doesn't look like it.
All right, well, great. This kind of has everything here. I'm going to look to the city to share the slide deck that I sent earlier and the YouTube link if you have it. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you. I wish you much success as you are planning your nonprofits. And I want to thank the City of Chicago Business Affairs and Consumer Protection for having me and allowing me to present.
Thank you. If you are part of the BACP Entrepreneur Certificate Program, you can get credit for joining this webinar by sending an email to bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org. Thank you and have a great weekend.